Is the Windows 10 end of life forcing you to buy a new desktop PC? Custom built PC can be a great option if you want control over the quality, budget, specification for any use case. In this video, I'll walk through a step-by-step installation process for installing a Windows Ultra Series 2 desktop. My build is for productivity, not gaming. I'll be using the desktop for video editing, programming, and learning AI development. At this time, I'm still waiting to get my hands on the NVIDIA's new RTX 50 series GPU. Let's look at the components for this build. First, the processor. I have the Intel Ultra Core 7 265K Series 2 processor. This CPU has inbuilt graphic processing capabilities and needs a motherboard with LGA 1851 socket. Next, I have the MSI Tomahawk Mag Z890 Wi-Fi motherboard. This is my first time trying a MSI motherboard. The motherboard has lots of I/O ports, M.2 SSD slots, and seems to provide the best value for the money. Next, I have the Western Digital Black SN850X M2 2TB SSD. This is again my first time trying a Western Digital M2 SSD, but it had great reviews and found it on a good deal. Next, I have the G.Skill Trident Z5 DDR5 RGB series 64GB RAM, the only RGB item in my build. It has a timing of 6400. I have used G.Skill Trident on my previous build and it's still going strong. Next, I have the Nocta Redux Air Cooler. It is a very compact cooler. It has an option of connecting another fan to the heatsink, but I'll be installing the base configuration with one fan. Next, I have the EVGA 1000W G6 Gold PSU. I had an EVGA PSU in my previous build and it's still working good. Lastly, I have the NZXT H7 Flow case. This case is huge but provides great cooling and plenty of room for a GPU. Let's get the motherboard out first. We will perform installing the components on the motherboard first before moving the board to the case. The motherboard manual will be a great help during the installation, so have it handy, printed or on a tablet. Once you have the socket latch open, the protective cap pops off and the CPU is ready to install. The CPU needs to be dropped in and not pushed down. The pins on the CPU and the motherboard are delicate and hence no force should be applied. The two notches on the CPU and the golden triangle on the CPU should help with the orientation of installing the CPU. Once the CPU is fully inserted, you can close the slot and put the latch back on. Next, I will install the NVMe M.2 SSD. Many slots are screwless and you can press and pull the shield off. Ensure to remove the protective film before installing the SSD. The SSD should be inserted at a 45-degree angle till the slot on the SSD are fully inside. Once the SSD is completely inside, you can put the shield back on. You should hear it click back to its place. Now let's install the RAM. In this motherboard, there is a latch that opens and closes only on one side. Open the latch and align the slots on the RAM and the motherboard. The RAM will go inside only one way. Push on both sides. The latch will close itself when the RAM is fully inserted. The order of the RAM should be as recommended by the motherboard. The corrected order is shown in the overlay. For two sticks, it's rightmost. Skip one next to it and install the second stick next to the slot skipped. The slot closest to the CPU should be empty. If you only have one RAM stick, it will be on the rightmost side. The Nocta Redux cooling fan requires a few steps. First, you want to take the back plate and insert the 4 bolts provided. The bolt should be inserted in position 2 as mentioned in the manual, as is the LGA 1851 slot. The 4 clips on the spacers should be inserted on the bolts before inserting the backplate to the motherboard. For installing the backplate, pick up the motherboard and insert the bolts of the backplate from behind the motherboard. You will need the thumb screws, blue plastic spacers which will be provided for LGA 1851, and the mounting bars or the brackets. First, insert the blue plastic spacers in the bolt sticking out. Next, install the brackets. The orientation of the brackets can be horizontal or vertical, but the curved side should be outside. Here I'll be installing it vertically. Next, I'll screw the thumb screws. Just use hands and do not over tighten it. At this point, the heatsink is ready to be installed. The thermal paste is pre-applied. You do not have to separately put thermal paste when installing it the first time. Make sure you do not take the plastic cover off till you are ready to install the heatsink. The orientation of the mounting bracket will drive the direction of the heatsink. Now align the heatsink screws to the middle of the mounting bracket and screw it in to secure the heatsink. Again, do not over tighten it. This completes a complex part of the fan installation for the CPU. The fan just clips on to the heatsink. You can attach it on either side of the heatsink, but make sure the arrow on the fan points towards the heatsink. This is because the heatsink pulls heat away from the CPU and the air needs to flow into the heatsink to keep the heatsink cool so that it can keep taking more heat away from the CPU. Ensure the fan is secure. Now the fan cable should be plugged into the CPU fan 1 in this motherboard. Congratulations, you have now completed one of the most complex steps of building a PC. At this point, I will move the motherboard to my NZXT H7 case. The holes on the motherboard will need to be lined up to the holes on the case. You can use the screws provided with the case or motherboard to screw the motherboard to the case. You will also see the PCI slots will line up with the case opening. Now I'll attach the EVGA G6 PSU to the case. I have flipped the case now. The motherboard is installed on the other side. Keep an eye on the PSU fan and switch position. The switch should be available outside the case and the PSU fan should be facing outside in the H7 flow. But this might not happen in a different PC case. Once the PSU is in the right slot, you can screw it in. Next, let's connect the motherboard to the power supply. You need the motherboard power cable that comes with your PSU. The side that connects to the PSU has two parts. Both need to be inserted. Once the cable is connected to the PSU in the H7 flow, I'll push the other end to the other side for connecting the motherboard. On the motherboard, there is only one pin that will take this connector. It should be ATX power 1 on this motherboard. It will only go one way and it would snap in. Now the motherboard gets power from the PSU. Next, the CPU needs to be connected to the PSU for power. I'm first connecting the cable to the CPU power 1, but you can also connect to CPU power 2 and then pushing the cable to the other side to connect to the PSU. As you can see here, the PSU has two ports called CPU 1 and CPU 2. In my case, I'm connecting to CPU 1, but CPU 2 will work as well. With this connection, the CPU should get power from the PSU. At this point, we only have the cables from the H7 flow that are sticking out from the back that needs to be connected to the motherboard. Next, let's go over each of these connections one by one. For the power button on the case to work, the F panel cable needs to be connected to the motherboard. In this motherboard, it needs to be connected to the JFP1 port. Just line up the pins and holes and ensure it is fully inserted. Next, let's connect the front USB-C to motherboard. The front USB-C has a I-shaped connector. It needs to be inserted into the J-USB-C port on the motherboard. It needs to be inserted at an angle and hence a little tricky. So I take the cable again to the back of the case and bring it from there to the front. From the back, it is easy to insert it in the required angle. Once connected, the front USB-C should be fully functional. For connecting the two front USB-A connectors, the blue tipped cable needs to be inserted into the J USB 3 connector. Check the pins and the holes on the connector to line up properly. Ensure it's fully inserted. This mess of wires I pulled from the back of the case powers the 3 front intake fans in the H7 flow case. The good news is that these wires are daisy chained, which means we only need to connect one end to the motherboard and it'll power all the 3 fans. The end can be connected to any of the sys fan ports. In my case, I'm connecting it to the sys fan 6. Once connected, the messy cables can be pushed to the back of the case. In my case, I'm installing an optional top exhaust fan near the CPU to push the hot air out of the case. When installing the fan, make sure the airflow direction is as per what you want. Once the fan is screwed into the case, you just need to plug the wire into one of the sys fan port. I'm plugging it into the sys fan 1 port. If everything goes well, you should be able to see the different components in the BIOS. I had to troubleshoot a few things before I was able to capture this first run video of my desktop. Once your components are showing up on the BIOS, you're ready to install the operating system.